welcome back to Arts Respond on WNHHLP 103.5 FM New Haven. I'm your host, Lucy Gellman, and today I'm talking to Noelle Fair and Matt Simmons of the Eastbound Theater Company or Eastbound Theater. This is community radio at its finest. I like to put company after everything. I think it's just a tick, but of Eastbound Theater, and we are talking about Anthol Fugard's My Children, My Africa, which is running at the Milford Arts Council, or the MAC, as you may know it, from January 31st through February 15th, Fridays and Saturdays at 7:30 p.m. and Sundays at 2 p.m. I know that was kind of a long introduction, so we'll hop right in. First of all, welcome to both of you.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, I'm so happy you're here. And thank you for folks who don't know, we're pre-recording this. So thank you for your patience in doing that. I really appreciate it. So Noelle, I want to toss it to you first. You are directing the show,
Yes.
and I would love to know a little bit more about the show for listeners who haven't heard of it before, maybe haven't heard of Fugard before, although I think he may be like one of the best known playwrights at like ever. I don't know. I I don't know. I remember coming across him for the first time I think freshman year of high school,
Oh, wow.
and and our teacher being like really, really excited to expose us to this playwright. We read Master Harold and the Boys.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
Mm.
but so I'm wondering if you can talk about the show and what drew you to directing it.
Um,
Oh,
Oh, she
oh,
muted herself.
I'm so sorry. I think I may have been trying to mute myself and muted
uh,
you instead. I am so, so sorry.
there we go. I think I unmuted myself.
You you sound beautiful.
Okay, great. So the show, My Children, My Africa, is set in the during the apartheid in South Africa. It's around 1985. Um, so I mean, it fell around 1994, so it's near the end of it, but it's also it's very intimate show. It only has three characters. And it is actually centered around a real life teacher by the name of Anela Mayalata, who was lynched for being potentially a police informer. Later, it was found out that he was not a police informer. And not that Fugard knew who he was or had a connection with him, but he saw this news clip and was very much inspired to imagine the events that led toward that event. And so, what he imagined here is Mayalata's, who in the play is referred to as Mr. M, um, relationship with his brilliant protege, Tommy Mbagwana, who is played by Matt. And they have had a long-standing relationship of Tommy is Mr. M's favorite, but now we're at a crossroads where Tommy has grown up seeing the frustration of his people and wants change for his country, for his future, and for his own freedom. And they have two very different ideas of how they want to go about it. Mr. M believes that in the power of education and the power of the word, and Tommy is about physical change, even if that means violence. In the midst of all of this, there becomes a school event where a girl from a white school outside of the location gets involved, and her name is Isabel. She ends up sort of representing the all-meaning white liberal, and she is sort of playing the go between the two men, right? She's encouraging them to talk, to work it out for the betterment of each other and for their own well-being. And so all of this kind of comes to a head really quickly, and disaster and tragedy happen. But also, I think that it carries this uplifting message of despite difficult times, um, there's hope. So I saw this show 20 years ago, actually, as a student in college. I actually had it was for a design class, and I was supposed to go and see a couple of different shows. We had to pick one. I randomly picked this one because it worked out with my schedule, and I just was blown away. Um, my father took me, and I sat there in my seat, and I couldn't move for 5 minutes after watching this show, and I it made me very curious about the apartheid because I don't think we're taught much about it in US schooling. Um, and I've kind of always had this show in the back of my brain, but it's always sort of timing, right? Like I I didn't even think that the Eastbound Theater would pick it because I pitched two other shows, and I thought there's no way they're going to pick this show, and they did. So I'm excited to direct it. You know, I kind of initially always wanted to be in it, but as I've gotten older, I am no longer age appropriate. And when they picked this, I said, okay, here we go. And I think it's incredibly relevant. It's incredibly powerful. Audiences definitely come out of it feeling like they were struck with something. It seems like they all become very moved by it. And it is a very powerful piece of theater.
I feel like there's so much to unpack there, but Matt, I also want to bring you into this conversation. You said you've been with Eastbound for about 2 years before we hopped on mic. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about both what draws you to community theater, and then specifically, it sounds like this, perhaps even in the best of political circumstances, would be a really tough play to step into. Like some plays are just very like physically, mentally, and emotionally taxing, even if the world is like doing really well. I think right now the world is, and Noelle, you kind of said this at a really tough it kind of feels like inflection point. Um, and so you're stepping into this role that's difficult and that's heavy. So tell me about that.
Yeah, so like I was saying, I've been doing shows with Eastbound Theater for the past like 2 years or a little over 2 years. I have been doing community theater as a whole for about the past 6 years. Just a little right after I finished college, I went to school to study education, and then I also studied theater on the side, and then fell in love with the stage and wanted to really get deeper into pursuing that. But Noelle had actually seen me in a previous production of another show that I was in, and then reached out to me about auditioning for My Children, My Africa, and was so glad to have like taken that chance and just really gotten into it because there was just so much that I got to learn. I was never even exposed to like apartheid and stuff like that, growing up. I was actually born in 95, so a year after, apartheid came to an end and like stuff like that. Like I really didn't know a lot about Nelson Mandela. I only took one class on African history in college, which was basically like about like the pre-colonialism era. So was going into this production like not really having a lot of background knowledge on apartheid and stuff like that. And it is a lot of like what is it stuff that my character Tommy Mbekwana, has to say and like what he's feeling and going through. There's a really like what is it like heavy monologue that he gives towards the end of the first act where he talks about how he just has no desire to pursue his dreams of becoming a doctor anymore because of the awful stuff that he's seeing with apartheid and systemic racism, and how, young black men and young black women don't have these opportunities as, like young, like white people do in this area. And having to see like, his parents and like family members and like other like adults be like, humiliated in like a land that they inherited like before like white settlers and stuff like that is just so powerful when he talks about that. Like I just always like in the audience, it's just amazing to just see like how like they're completely silent and almost maybe like have like goosebumps just hearing a lot of this stuff.
I bet. I bet. And since both you and Noelle brought it up, I'm wondering, we um, in this country are like almost notoriously bad at teaching both U.S. history and world history. It's like a 1-2 punch of offensiveness. And so, Noelle, as you both fell in love with or were very moved by this show and then it sounds like it stayed with you and you really have been thinking about how to bring it to the stage yourself.
Mhm.
Um, I'm wondering what both of you did to educate yourselves as you stepped into this theater space.
So I actually am a teacher, and Matt is actually a substitute. So we both are also, yeah, we both actually also have a bit of background in education
Sure
field.
do.
Yes,
So
and shout out educate y'all are literally doing God's work. I
Oh,
really
thank you.
believe there's truly I really believe there's not a more important job than teachers.
well, thank you.
Thanks.
Um, so I've taught. Connecticut has actually put out a Black and Latino course in the past 3 years for high school students. And so I teach that now. And I'm sorry, I forgot your original question.
No, I was gonna say just, what did you do to prepare yourselves to be in this space where you're talking about apartheid and the literal lived experience of apartheid, which of course was part of Fugard's life and oeuvre. But
Yes.
in this country, I feel like if folks learn about it, even in like AP World History, it's like half a unit. It's really bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So all right, so that was how I was going there. Because I was teaching this course, I was looking for an end of year project, and I got hooked on, out of my own personal interest and my sister's recommendation, Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime, where he talks about living, because he has a Swiss German father and a Black Afrikaans mother. And he talks about how he was white in a Black world and Black in a white world. And I learned about lived experience through the apartheid through that, and I shared a lot of the materials that I had gathered for teaching my students to then share with the actors. I also had to go and look up. There's so many words in there that are in Zulu or Hausa. We had to look up what those meanings were. We had to learn a little bit about how to do the clicks, because that does come up in our show as well. Tommy especially uses some of those throughout. So we have those peppered in. Um, there's references that Tommy makes to certain events, so I had to put together a bit of a timeline. We had to learn about the history of Bantu education during the apartheid. We actually had a professor, one of our producers brought in a professor, Lily Saint, from, I think she's from Wesleyan, and she did a talk with the whole cast, and she had a wealth of knowledge, and we were able to ask questions about specifics in the text. So that was part of our preparation. Matt, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think pretty much a lot of the stuff you were saying because you provided us with a lot of those resources on like pronunciations and stuff like that too. Because I mean, even like Tommy, like there's a lot of words that like he is like pronouncing that come from like like Bantu and like Afrikaans culture and stuff like that. Even like there's like certain like clicks with like mentioning stuff like words like the Hassa and the Inkululeko and things like that. So really trying to master those kinds of like pronunciations. And myself, I mean, I'm normally a person that can speak a mile per minute. So I definitely wanted to make sure that I was like slowing down and like my like dialogue and stuff like that and really focusing on like articulating my words like that were like in the script. So, the audience can better understand them, but also to really capture the, like the authenticity of, this being a story set in South Africa, and this is an audience that is basically getting to hear like, you know, in English language, but from like, a South African culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I want to talk about, your like hopes and dreamy dreams for this show and for audiences. Um, but I'm also curious how it feels. So also, when did you pitch the show?
They were looking for directors about this time last year, or it was like maybe around March of
So it
last
it was
year.
before, yeah, because every theater company moves differently. But I was going to say it was probably way before everything in this country,
Uh-huh.
like sort of there have been like a number of seismic shifts. It's
It
not
was
just
before
like
the
one.
election, yes.
Yeah, but it's even like Joe Biden was still the presumptive nominee or presumptive candidate at that
Sure.
point, right? Um, and so I am curious, like we know that the arts almost famously, although I have, plenty of my own feelings on this, can be a very bipartisan thing. And so I don't want to say that community theater is for one group or another or one voting block or another. However, um, we are living in this like really wild political moment.
Yeah,
Um, I, I personally feel that as, as a reporter, as someone who has friends who are queer and friends who are immigrants, and like a lot of things are happening right now.
yeah.
And so I'm curious how it feels to be opening and performing this show at this specific moment, knowing full well that when you pitched it, like you didn't know what the world was going to look
No.
like in like 2 months, let alone in a year, right?
Yes, originally the thought was, we would use this as a way to celebrate Black history and to kind of go, okay, as this is how far we've come, or not necessarily us, but we can acknowledge our past and whatnot. And I guess, I mean, that wasn't my purpose in pitching it. It was literally because I just love this play. Um, I also, just from experience, like I've lived abroad, right? And I think when you live abroad out of this country, you realize that the US is not necessarily the center of the global interest. And I have, since living abroad, always been interested in other people's stories from other countries and other cultures. And so I pitched it because of all of those reasons. And so, of course, now, Kamala is not our president, unfortunately. That is how I feel about it. I don't expect audiences to feel that way. I also don't think that the play is inherently political. Um, it really deals with three people living under these difficult circumstances. And so, I think though people can see in these three characters some part of themselves because you have people of an older generation. Mr. M is very staunch in his way of like, yes, we do want change, but he works within the system that he's given, right? Um, and I think there's a group that can identify with that does want long range change, just as the younger generation does, but he goes about it in a very different way that is not as satisfying to, say, this Gen Z generation, which is what Tommy feels very Gen Z in this. Um, and then you have sort of the people that aren't necessarily being affected in a bad way, like Isabel. She's benefiting from this fascist system that she's in. Um, but she does see the injustices, and what does she do? What can she do to help? So I think it's sort of sitting in this very interesting place in our society right now. And all told, people are, I keep telling the cast, these characters are living on the edge of a revolution. And I feel very much like, yes, we as a country are on the edge of something happening, something big to collapse. And it's like, it's very tangible, almost a little scarily so.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this show is happening as we're going through a coup, right? Like,
So one thing I was really picking up on a lot too is, there's a really great line where in the second act of this show where my character Tommy talks about how, when change isn't, being made for, certain types of people, they will take matters into their own hand for that change to happen. And during the middle of our rehearsal process, we had the, awful tragedy with the United Healthcare CEO that happened. Basically kind of an example of, people taking matters in their own hands when their voices aren't being heard. And that is one of like the recurring themes of this story that I feel like happens. And, overall, I am hoping that we can get as many people in seats like at the theater to see this story. My dad actually got to see it over the weekend on opening weekend, and he just had nothing but great things to say. I think it really resonated with him and many of his, struggles of, how he's experienced like racism and
Mm.
out there and like his own like personal life and stuff like that too and everything. And I'm hoping it'll just speak to a lot of people in different aspects, but regardless of, being African American or, like any like kind of like background.
yeah, I am also curious about some of those conversations, in the rehearsal room or as you're going through the script, especially this central question, which in the reporting space, I see this between activist groups all the time. Noelle, this question of do you advocate for change through education and nonviolent protest, or or do you sort of like you said, Matt, take it into your own hands and have like a by any means necessary approach?
Mm.
And so, have there been some of those conversations? Because these like folks are talking about this in a very real way in
Yeah.
across the country, but including in Connecticut, which we think about it as a blue state, but there are plenty of factions, even within folks who maybe are left of center and doing work that is pro-immigrant, pro-LGBTQ, pro-woman, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, we definitely during the rehearsal process had to have those difficult conversations, and I'm not gonna lie, there's part of me that at times go, it was like, if there was a difficult moment we had to confront in a way, it was like, am I am I am I being a white person in this situation, right? And I think I still constantly ask myself, like, did I do something during the process? Did those thoughts are there, right? Um, I think though what has been good is everybody's been willing to have those conversations. And this is a really smart group of actors. Like everyone seems to know when I bring up references, they seem to all know what I'm talking about. Um, and also, there's references in the text to these characters admitting that they were uncomfortable around people that don't look like them, people that don't act like them, and then how that though changes them. And so, I mean, I think we had to be open to those conversations, and I think we just got lucky with the actors that we chose, that they're smart and inquisitive and willing and brave to have those conversations. So yeah, it has to occur, you know. The show inherently is about race, right? Like it just is.
Hmm. And I think that's the point, that storytelling is another way of, you know, being able to educate people on these kinds of topics and, kind of have change, just art in general. I think of, like, a lot of those, artists from like the 60s during the civil rights movement, like Joan Baez and all of them, who were able to kind of like, vouch for change through like their art and things like they did and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that. And I know last week, when Trump said that there was going to be a freeze on federal funding, one of the things I did was talk to artists and arts administrators who had been beneficiaries of mostly NEA funding in some way, shape, or form. But someone I talked to, and Matt, you're totally right, is like artists have always been agitators, and
Mm-hmm.
folks have always tried to shut them down because
Mhm.
when we share our stories, we it is an entry into a conversation that is, I think, for folks on either side of the political divide, feels far less hostile than me like getting up in your face and saying, well, I feel this way and I'm going to shut you down if you feel that way, versus sharing my lived experience. Or in your case, bringing the lived experiences of these folks in Fugard's world, inspired by real world experiences, to the stage and just telling those stories. Noelle, I also want to ask you, and Matt, I'd love to hear from you too. This is a very small cast,
Yeah.
and something that Jenny Nelson, who is over at Collective Consciousness Theater, said to me last year was it's actually so much more difficult to direct with a small cast. Like the misconception is that the hardest pieces to direct are like big ensemble shows, and that's not actually her experience. And so I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I can relate. I have a master's in Shakespeare, and I typically do a lot of directing of Shakespeare. So I have large casts a lot. And yes, it's a different kind of beast. But I don't think it's not difficult though in terms of people, if that makes sense. Like, sometimes in a big cast you might have one or two people that are not the most professional or are not the most responsible, and that's just inherent in what we do. um, you can always think of that colleague who doesn't pull their weight, right? In a smaller cast though, everybody really does have to pull their weight. And I think though what I found difficult with this was more just um, because these guys have massive speeches, right? It wasn't a matter of taming personalities. It was like hoping that your your students, for lack of a better term, you would prep them appropriately for the test. I think at some point, like I started to be hard on them when they were trying to get off book, and then I have to take a step back and realize like they are memorizing behemoths of text. They have 10-minute monologues amongst their monologues in their scenes. They're carrying this, and they're carrying an emotional weight of all of this. So at some point, I had to take a step back and just be a supportive mom in a way, right? And help get them there the best way that I can get them there. And all three of them needed different things at different times. So that was more the challenge. And also, typically in an ensemble show, you kind of naturally get like baby steps progression toward the opening. This one was like never consistent, and it was terrifying. It was terrifying for me. I'm sure they were okay, but I was terrified. And really, it's been that kind of a process. But yeah, that's been my experience with it. I'm curious what Matt would say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was gonna say,
No,
Matt,
honestly,
hop
I would say this is the smallest show I've done, like as of yeah, like to this day. Cast of three. I mean, before I had done a couple like plays that were a cast of four, which primarily were at Eastbound. It's a small stage, so we usually do small cast shows there, but it was very, very interesting. I mean, luckily, I had actually done a production of August Wilson's Fences with one of the actors who plays Mr. M. So there already was some chemistry there. What is it like beforehand? But definitely a lot of like, what I was saying with a lot of these like monologues, and they each have their own individual stories that we get to learn more about during those monologues. So you see like what they're carrying, what they're thinking, what they feel, and how they're reacting to the world around them. And then it's almost like a social experiment where you see them like pretty much like be in the same room together, like and interacting with one another in like these scenes and stuff like that. I think one of the most fun scenes that I did was with Sabrina, who plays Isabel in the show, and it's when Mr. M leaves us in like the classroom alone. So it's his first time, it's Tommy's first time, being with, in a room with a white girl, and it's Isabel's first time being in a room with a black guy. So they're kind of like, fish out of water and then kind of like awkwardly interacting with stuff. And I remember like Noelle would just be like cracking up when we like would do it at rehearsals and stuff like that and everything too.
The
But
audience
yeah,
laughed
just like
too.
just being so learning to just be comfortable with one another, which we just have been able to do like so well and stuff, I think. And I'm just very grateful for, the other two like cast members that I like get to work with and stuff also at the end of the day.
I was gonna say it really helps, especially when the show is that small, if you like the other people you're working with.
Hmm.
I mean,
Um,
I had worked with
yeah.
Sabrina beforehand, and I had heard nothing but good things about Matt. So there was that, and then our producer was actually good friends with the gentleman who plays Mr. M, whose name is Herman. And I knew he had handled really large patriarchal roles before. So yeah, I mean, I mean, the auditions themselves were a lot of people that we all were familiar with, but I felt like this group of people and who knew who, it would work.
I'm also curious, either as you're preparing for the show or in general, like what theater or it can be literature more broadly are you reading? Because I think especially in the past couple of years, there have been such powerful works about race and racism. I'm thinking about Fairview, which Collective Consciousness Theater did either last year or the year before. In New Haven, there's What to Send Up When It Goes Down, which was, I think, off Broadway, maybe on Broadway. I don't know. There, somewhere in the vicinity of Broadway in New York a couple of years ago. So what are you reading in addition to doing this?
So for me, at least, one of the other things is that outside of this whole experience that we've all been working on together for the past couple of months, one of my other jobs is I work at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford as
Which
a
is
living
such
history
a
actor
cool
there.
place.
Yes,
Like
I've
a
been there
really cool
for
place.
just about a year now, I want to say. I think I got hired on like just like right around this time last year, but I'm one of their living history actors and I play Samuel Clemens' real life butler, George Griffin. So he was a real life African American man who was born in Maryland. He was born enslaved, and then when he was around 12 years old, he ended up working for a body servant, kind of like a squire, like during the Civil War. And then once slavery was abolished, he worked his way up before becoming a butler for the family. So when I give these tours, race is talked about a lot and stuff like that. And funny enough, George Griffin was actually like one of the inspirations for Samuel Clemens to write Huckleberry Finn, which I had just actually started getting back into and reading myself. Noel actually had the opportunity to go on one of my tours around the holidays and meet George. And yeah, but there's a lot I talk about race a lot in this. I talk about, what it's like, being a man formerly enslaved and, being like well respected by one of the most well-known writers and humorists of the 19th century and stuff like that. And, being adored by his three daughters and stuff like that too and everything. And, many people who have been on those tours with me, they just feel like it is just such a timeless like story, and just now's a better time than ever to be telling like that kind of story to people and stuff, which I always just love what I do. It's one of the reasons why I love what I do at that place.
I'm well, okay. To be fair, I really actually have a huge interest in women's stories, um, and disabled women specifically because I know you can't see it if we're on the radio, but I'm a disabled actor from birth, and so I'm interested in those stories. But there's a play that I've been dying to produce called Amelia, which has an intersect or I'm not sure what that word is, but where all those things come together. So women, disabled, and race all come together. And it's a play that was commissioned by the Globe, and it's about Amelia Bassano Linnae, who they believe was the Dark Lady of the Sonnets of Shakespeare, but she was a real human too. She was part Moroccan. She was a Venetian Jew, and her family were musicians. So the belief was that she was around the musicians of Shakespeare's plays. And so that's how she might have come in contact with Shakespeare because he references a woman playing a piano. Um, she was also the first English woman to publish her poetry, and her sentiment is very much in line with Amelia from Othello, kind of like men have treated her badly. And so she says, she has a line about they do deface the very wombs from which they came, right? So the Globe commissioned an entire play about Amelia's life, and it's played by three women of color throughout her life. The rights dictate that you have to have at least two women who are who identify as having a disability on either the crew or the cast. And total, you can have anywhere from 10 women to like 25 if you really wanted. But I've always wanted to have that produced closer to home. It's been produced abroad and other places. And so that is something that I'm dying, another story of riotous rebellion of women that I'm desirous to produce.
Oh my gosh, yes, please. Well, I feel
I
like
just
we need
gotta
to get
find a
this show.
theater.
I want this show in Connecticut. I
I do
want to hear
too.
about it. Yeah, I mean, this is that sounds
I was gonna say,
incredible.
I'm like literally as you were talking about that, I'm like thinking about like friends who I could like, what is it like recommend or like refer you to that would
Heck
Yes.
be great
yeah.
for this.
Yeah, or it doesn't have to be in, whatever. I mean, I love Connecticut because well, that's not true. I love New Haven, because I live here. Uh, and Matt, I'm curious, have you also read James by Percival
James is on
Everett?
my list actually, and
Yeah.
I've actually had we actually did have Percival Everett, the writer, do a book talk at the Mark Twain House. We
Oh
have
my
like lots of writers
gosh.
who like come and
Yeah.
do like book talks, and it's part of a series that we do called The Trouble Begins.
Yeah.
So I've been like I have like attended some of those lectures and stuff like that, and they're really great. The first one I ever went to was the one based on my person I play, George Griffin, because we actually had the person who wrote the biography on George come,
Oh
and
wow.
that we actually also got the photo of George publicly revealed, which was very, very cool
Wow.
when that happened. But James actually is on my reading list. So I usually when what we do is when we have our living history tours, we're in character for an entire hour with these people like in the house. So once we break character at the very end, we take them downstairs to the cellar exhibit, which was the cellar portion of the house, and we have conversations with them out of character, asking them, answering any questions they may have or stuff like that. But usually, I actually show them a little like page that has a notice in Huckleberry Finn, which refers to my person George. He's referred to as GG, Chief of Ordnance, but then I'll tell them about James, and then there's also a graphic novel. I'm a big comic book guy, so graphic novels I like too. There's one that they've done about Huckleberry Finn, but or with Jim, called Big Jim and the White Boy, which
Mm.
is another one I definitely want to check out myself. But it's funny, so funny that you mentioned James because not a lot of people are familiar with it, surprisingly, but that is on my reading list.
I feel like it is so, I have not read it. It's also on my list. But I feel like it's one of the most like hyped up books of 2024. And either won or I think was in second place for the Booker Prize.
Oh wow.
Um, yeah. So that's yeah. And have you found that both this show and Matt, also your experience at the Twain House, because sometimes people, as I think especially in this climate, are prickly in talking about race and racism.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
I very rarely do I get like, like a lot of like, people of color on my tours. So it's mainly like, like white tour members and stuff like that. But I talk a little bit about Harriet Beecher Stowe because she lived in the same community as Sam Clemens. So, when we see the view of her house from outside, I tell them about, her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and how it made a lot of people, especially white people, think about the effects of enslavement and stuff like that. And how, President Lincoln called it the book that started the Great War and stuff like that,
Hmm.
and how George himself has a lot of respect for, Mrs. Stowe for writing that book and stuff. And one of the things that always are kind of like, what is it, that I always just love because I always pick up on people's body language during my tours. But when I'm in character as George, I talk about how, things aren't easy for Black folks still in Hartford, but I am my own man and no one can take that away from me. And now, I work for like, what is it, a man who respects me, that man being Samuel Clemens, but I also own my own house. And I like see like all these people, their smiles just light up. They sound like they're like so happy for me and proud for me. Some of them are like, good for you when they hear that too and stuff like that. But it's definitely, that story is definitely reaching out to a lot of people and really just inspiring them. There's ways that it can, like we were saying, kind of talking about during one of our meetings last week. There's ways that our stories can sometimes be relatable to people, even if like, there aren't physical similarities and stuff like that.
I think I think sometimes people, and I'm speaking from just the white experience here, but I think white people can be nervous about offending. I think that that can be a thing, but I think there's also a level of guilt and defensiveness because I think sometimes white people can feel like they're blamed for the things that happened or the things that are happening. And I think because they're not experiencing some of the injustice, they don't acknowledge it. Um, and I think, yeah, I think, I mean, I don't, I my graduate education system really addressed it a lot of the time, but more so than that, like thankfully for a few people that I've known of color who during that like learning about it, they got very emotional. And I think what I gathered and learned from that experience was just like these are just people, right? Who have experienced difficult things, and I was so struck by their emotion. And I don't know why it took that one person because I have Black family members. I've grown up in DC, Baltimore area. Like I've been around diversity my whole life, but there's still always a part of that experience in the US with having to deal with race that just we never got beyond the whole color doesn't matter. And yes, people are people. I think that is the message, but I also think that you need to acknowledge and be exposed to and learn someone else's story, right? I just think that that is so important for compassion, for empathy, and for understanding why a group feels the way that they do. I don't
Oh,
think it's
yeah.
about blame or guilt or judgment or defensiveness. I think that that just needs to you need to move beyond it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are we're in real time seeing from Washington what happens when folks don't want to talk about the toll of white supremacy has historically had, but that still has on this country. And you see that in um, sort of this like sweeping rollback of rights. Um, and unless we forget, and Matt, I don't know if you talk about this on your tour, but I remember a couple years ago, I was reporting a story and I was shocked to learn that slavery was legal in Connecticut, the practice of slavery until
Uh-huh.
1848. And
Mhm.
actually in New Haven, which is where I live, what I call home, the last sale of enslaved Black people on the New Haven Green was in 1825. So we're talking about extremely recent history.
Mhm.
Um, and I have also found that in some rooms in this state, and I grew up in Michigan, so also, what people would consider the North, that folks say, well, I wasn't implicated in that, and my ancestors weren't implicated in that, and I had nothing to do with it. And actually, like you if you're a white person, you probably did.
Yeah,
Mhm.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think you can forget, like Connecticut was one of the last states in New England to completely get rid of it, and it
that's
was
Yes.
right.
gradual. It wasn't like it overnight it happened. It was a gradual process.
And the state, if I'm not mistaken, kept indentured servitude on the books, which
100%.
is which is
Yeah.
a which is just a different word. Um, but
Yes.
yeah. So, but when we think of how we still treat people as less than because we've categorized them or othered them.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Well, if you watch the 13th documentary,
Yes.
right,
Oh,
that brilliantly connects the
mhm.
idea of slavery in the US to our current criminal system and how we criminalize Black bodies. I mean, what they just executed Marcellus Williams,
Yes.
right, being innocent. And we, in a sense, are legalizing slavery once again in the criminal justice system. There's also connections to education. I mean, I learned about this through being an educator. Like in New York, they talk about how by third grade, they look at the state reading scores and they decide how many prisons to build. It's insane how
Mhm.
much still that systemic racism is built into our system.
Absolutely. And we
Even
know,
and
oh,
even
go ahead,
too,
go
I
ahead.
mean, just seeing like so many like, students of color who just get so overlooked with so many different things. They're not getting the services they need in school systems. At my time working in schools, and I'm sure Noel can attest to that as well, they just like slip through the cracks so easily with things. I myself am one of those examples. Went through my whole entire like, like grade school, like, like career of, grades K through 12 without being diagnosed for ADHD until like just like recently and stuff like that. And probably would have like saved me so much like struggles and like hassles if like that did. But like had this conversation with my family and stuff like that. I was like, I really don't think like they really paid close attention to me,
Mhm.
and still is going on to this day.
Yes, a lot of students of color get labeled as either having a disability or as a behavior issue, and as
Mhm.
a result, get more suspensions and then don't finish and then end up in trouble.
Or labeled as lazy or
Right.
stuff like that too. And that, when they're struggling with like academics and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to bring it back to the show because I think that actually all of this is tied together. Um, so Eastbound Theater, for folks who haven't been listening, please go back and listen to the whole interview because it's been great, is presenting My Children, My Africa at the Milford Arts Council, MAC, the MAC, from January 31st through February 15th on Fridays and Saturdays at 7:30 p.m. and Sundays at 2 p.m. And it is like right there next to the train station in Milford. It's extremely convenient to get to. If you don't have a car or you don't drive, you can still get there. There's also a bus that goes there, but CT Transit is very broken, which is another issue that has to do with systemic racism and how things are funded in this state and this country. But I want to ask both of you, this is a show. I mean, I think what's striking about Fugar's work is um, there's a lot in there, including there is humor. Um, and both of you sort of mentioned like at some points the audience is like laughs, and then they're like stunned into silence. Um, but it's also a heavy show.
Yeah.
Um, I think whenever we're talking about apartheid, it's probably a heavy experience, or if it's not, maybe someone should go like interrogate their own biases, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how both of you take care of yourselves as artists, as community members, as educators who are also going from the classroom, which can be a very rewarding but also very difficult experience, going from that to the show.
I'm not being very good about that right now.
Yeah.
I think the lead up has been difficult, right? Because you're not just I mean, with any community theater, you're not just directing when you go to the rehearsal. You're also like creating costumes and I was doing photography at times too. So there was a lot, right? Now that the show is opened, I'm a little bit better. I'm able to come home and have dinner and relax with my husband and sleep. That has been the biggest recovery is just sleeping. And I'm pretty good about separating, right? Like I think at the end of the day, right, like this is a play where we get to imagine this and then we get to leave it and go home. When we're on breaks, we're joking with each other. So I think breaking that reality has been helpful, right?
Yeah, I
Matt,
think
what about you? Yeah.
self-care is just super important. After we finished, Tech Week, I just have been able to just catch up on rest and, give myself the rest I needed. I'm still like, working and stuff like that through the week, but I'm very good at, giving myself, like Fridays off to just like rest up and prepare for like the upcoming weekend. Just been more intentional now about just spending my time like in the Word. I'm a Christian, and my faith has just been very important to me. So, it just helps me like, stay grounded and stuff like that. And also too, it's just, being able to practice gratitude, especially when we are dealing with heavy stuff like with apartheid and systemic racism and violence and stuff like that, just to be blessed to, be in a situation I'm in right now and stuff like that, and not be like in like a place where, Tommy is or Mr. M is, to be experiencing that stuff around them. And, basically making time for family and friends. My family is currently sick right now. Both my
Oh,
parents
goodness.
the flu. So,
Oh,
I'm home, taking care of like, like dinner and prepping meals and stuff like that. I am staying healthy, just so you
good.
know. I'm like wearing my mask like every like what is it, anywhere, like I'm like around them and stuff, but making time for family and friends and just making time to like do things that I like to do, whether it's, just, shutting off my brain after coming home from work to just, watch like a TV show on like Netflix, or, play like my favorite video game, or like read like a book or something like that. Just to like unplug until like it's that time. So I think self-care and making time for the things you love and the people you love.
I love that. Noel, I also want to ask you, so I know that you're a relatively new Connecticut resident.
Yeah.
And so do you have, like special places in the state, or places that you love where you're like, this is really my jam?
Oh gosh. So I'm definitely still exploring.
Great.
I do live in like the like near the coast, right? And I moved here specifically because we were near the beach. And so I like when, especially when the weather gets warm, going down to the beach to have happy hours at the end of the day. Because it's literally 5 minutes down the road, which is great. I have taken to like TikTok and stuff to learn about local haunts and things. I really liked Legends of Fear when I did that back in October. And I really enjoyed Hogan's Cider Mill up in Burlington. That was really cool. And we meant to check out, but we have not yet, the Lantern Festival. I forget what, I think it's Lyman Orchards, I want to say. Um, so those have been some places that I have checked out that I really enjoy. It's just definitely things on the coast, and then um, those two attractions have been fun. I think it's definitely been nice to move from the city, and New York City has so much to offer, but at the same time, it was really nice to settle in this community and to discover the local area, and I really enjoyed it. It's been nice.
New York is a little, I find it overwhelming, maybe because I'm from the Midwest, and so I like big open spaces, and people who are just like very nice, although they're like fake Midwestern nice, but that's a different episode. Um, yeah. And Matt, did you grow up in Hartford? You mentioned the Tween House. Did you grow up in Hartford?
I actually did not. I actually have lived in Milford for most of my life, I would say.
Oh,
I've
so
been
these are
up
your
on 18
stomping
years in Milford.
grounds.
Yeah, basically. So I grew up here. We moved here from New York. We lived in the Bronx in New York.
Oh
That's actually where my
wow.
parents grew up. That's where they met when they were teenagers and got married. And then they had me and my sister, and then we ended up moving to Connecticut. So I think we're coming up on 18 years of living in Milford. It's just been such a great place. I love like, downtown Milford and the Green. There's so much like cool stuff to see there, especially during the summertime is my favorite time to explore around there. Even the fall time. I remember like when I was going on a first date with someone, I actually had the idea of us going on a coffee walk. So we went to like Cafe Atlantique, walked around the Green, and I showed her a lot of like my favorite places to eat. I showed her the Mac, and I was like, "Hey, this is the Mac where I've done shows. I'm actually have an audition coming up for this one show, which was the show, believe it or not." The Post Mall is always another favorite spot. My friend and I love going there to, usually like grab like food and like a drink before going to see like a movie at the cinema there and stuff. And New Haven, I definitely love as well. Lots of like really, really great places to check out and like visit and stuff like that and see for like kind of like fun stuff. But Hartford, I am there usually when I'm working at the Twain House because a friend of mine I did community theater with a couple years ago actually reached out to me and told me that they were looking to cast an actor to play George Griffin there. So those are usually the times that I'm there mostly. But if I was a little bit closer, because it is an hour commute for me, I would love to make my way there more frequently to see stuff on like the Hartford stage and definitely check out a lot of the other like cool like events and like places and stuff in that area.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to talk to me, Matt Simmons and Noelle Fair. If you've been listening, great, but if you haven't, please go back and listen to the interview. Eastbound Theater is presenting My Children, My Africa from January 31st through February 15th on Fridays and Saturdays at 7:30 p.m. and Sundays at 2 p.m. at the Milford Arts Council or the MAC. If you want to find out more about the show, you can go to milfordarts.org and there's a theater tab. And the first like little drop down thing is about Eastbound Theater, and that will take you to a ticket link, a cast bio list, all that good stuff. Thank you both so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us, Lucy.
And it's evening while we're pre-recording this, so have a good night. Don't stay up too late. Or do, I don't know. I don't want to
Well,
get
snow
yeah.
day tomorrow.
We got a
What
snow
are
day
you gonna be
tomorrow.
doing? Yes,
Yeah, that's
I'll stay
right.
up late. Not a school
That's
night.
right. Awesome. Thank you.
Yes, thank you again. Have a good night.
Bye. Yes, you
Bye.
too.
Thank you.